Welcome back for this second part of the lecture on big science collaborations. What I'd like to talk about in this part of the lecture is two related topics. One is credit assignment in large scientific collaborations, and then especially authorship. How do you make sure everyone involved in a paper gets the credit they deserve? And this connects to the issue of consensus, and specifically how to approach diversity of opinion in large collaborations, which will inevitably appear, and specifically in the context of trying to write a paper together with hundreds or thousands of people. Let's start with credit assignment in big science collaborations in general. Now, often in such collaborations, and probably is also for the foreseeable future, authorship is the most important way, other than getting the Nobel Prize, of receiving credit for your work. Especially first authorship tends to be, in many communities, very important. Nonetheless, it's always, I think, good to be on the lookout for additional ways of assigning credit. On the one hand, because, for instance, some engineers care less about papers and authorship than some scientists. But also, the more ways of assigning credit, the more likely it is that everyone is happy and feels like they've given the credit that they deserve, and the less frustration there is, ideally. So here are a few examples one can think of. For instance, if someone has a very specific responsibility, give them a job title that reflects that, and also publish that job title on the website, especially if junior members have specific responsibilities. Another example is to have internal prizes, awards, but of course there's the caveat of what I said about the Nobel Prize, to not make things too individualistic and unrealistic. What tends to be quite important is to name, or quite valued, is to name a algorithm, equation, theorem, phenomena after the person who discovered it or played a major role in discovering it, if that's indeed done by one or a few people. And what I find interesting is when you talk to especially engineers, one thing they care a lot about is just being able to say in the CV or in the pub, whatever, I've built an awesome experiment. I have helped build LISA and the LHC, etc. That's just one fun and important result credit that I appreciate. Another option is to give people visibility at press conferences, but you can't, of course, let thousands of people present the results. Often in these cases, the scientists get to present the results and not the engineers, say, whereas maybe the engineers would be specifically interested in this visibility. And another regular way is giving talks, presenting the results of the collaboration at conferences, making sure that the appropriate people get to do that. And then, of course, if you're a junior person on the job market, then you shouldn't be assigned to conferences on completely different continents from where you're hoping to get a job. Okay, so let's zoom in specifically on authorship, because that is, for better or for worse, one of the main ways of getting credit for your work in these collaborations. And this comes with quite a few challenges. One is that if you have a long authorship list, especially if it's alphabetically ordered, that if you've worked a lot on that specific paper, that it feels like you're just lost in the sea of authors and your contribution is watered down. Junior members, especially when they need a job, first author papers are very important. It's difficult for them to be visible, especially they often focus on like just one paper for a whole year, and if they're then one of the 3,000 authors and they're somewhere in the middle, that can lead to frustration. As I said, engineers tend to think, in some cases, different about the value of papers and authorships than other people involved, and are maybe less likely to contribute to the writing, so authorship in the traditional sense, but of course they have contributed, so how to deal with that. And similarly for operators of telescopes. Another issue is, when do you decide on the author list, who gets to be an author and which order? Right? If you do this at the end, there's a long period of uncertainty. And let's say then there were two people who did much of the work, only one of them can be first author, and being a second author is often valued much less than first author, so that can lead to struggles. So you might say maybe just determine it at the very beginning, but that often disincentivizes everyone except for the first author to do any work for it, because they might be thinking like, well, I'll just go work on my first author paper, because this is only going to get me just, well, a not very valuable line on my CV, so to say. And another issue is, okay, who decides who is an author on a paper and in which order, right? If you have decided on who's on the paper and you ask to people to self-report how much they've done to determine who is first or last, etc. This can often lead to many biases in terms of character, gender, culture, as to how people self-report about how much they contributed. So then maybe you think, okay, maybe the first author or the PI should determine what the order is, but then, well, in such large collaborations, they might not have a good overview of what all the people on a different continent did, and this will lead to different biases. So lots of challenges, hurdles to be aware of when trying to develop an authorship practice that's tailored to a specific collaboration. A few more things. Even if you have come up with a very nice practice, sometimes journals don't work with you and insist on other practices. And what makes things even more complex is that often collaborations have different types of papers, like collaboration papers, official papers, related papers, and all these challenges might be different for the different types of papers, and you might have different practices for different types of papers. Okay, so what I want to do in the next few slides is give you a few options for if you're starting collaboration, or writing a paper with lots of people, how you might which authorship practice you might choose from. The first one, which tends to be dominant in particle physics, is just order everyone alphabetically. Very straightforward. Right, so for instance, here we see Alice collaboration. Lots of people all starting with the letter A. Of course, then if you've done most of the work and your last name starts with the letter C, that can be very frustrating. Also, the person starting with the A, if the paper is cited as Ad et al., the person gets a lot of responsibility just because of their last name. So another option you might consider is ICMGE, which is popular in the medical sciences, and this is quite a high bar for authorship. So there you only get to be listed as an author on the paper if you've made a substantial contribution, have actually written part of the paper, read the whole paper and approved the whole thing, and can be held responsible for all of it. Right, so this is a very high bar. The problem is that to get any result, like from the Atlas or the EHT, this is so many contributions necessary to get to that result, and many of these are not these kinds of contributions. So you can't just leave all those people of all the papers. You will never get these people in the future to work with you. So this is probably too high a bar for many of the collaborations I've been mentioning as examples in this lecture. Then another option called credit, which is popular in some areas of physics, where, well, you have some list of authors at the top in some order, but the point here is that in addition, somewhere in the paper, like a footnote or at the end, you give a description or a matrix where you say from, I think, 14 predetermined categories, like in which category every author contributed. So you can say, oh, well, I'm an author on this paper because I've done the data analysis and visualization, and other people contribute in different ways. Now, this is quite a decent approach, right? It means you can be very clear and specific about what people did, although you still have the issues of who decides and which do you self-report, or does someone else determine your contribution. But either way, even though this might in principle be good, this won't show up on your CV. So if junior members try to get a job and they're still author number 200, then this is not gonna, if people quickly scan their CVs, this is not gonna change anything if they're still not first author on the paper. Then perhaps a more radical proposal, authorship outdated, let's give up on authors altogether. Right, so Josh Hapgood says that people contributing a paper, the different norms involved, and these are often sometimes inconsistent. So there are often many contributors, but they might contribute inconsistent things. They would say, well, so the different role, there's also a writer role. It's the role of the writer to then tell a consistent, coherent story, regardless of all these contributions. And then you can say there are also other roles, such as spokespersons or guarantors, who then, for instance, present, defend, and reject the paper. So his proposal is to, instead of having authors, just having these different roles. And then fifth, another option is to, instead of having one list alphabetically ordered, to have a small group of people, the first or the 0th tier at the beginning, listed alphabetically, they're all on a par. And then the 2nd tier, you start alphabet again, a 3rd tier, etc., however many tiers you need, right? So for instance, all at the beginning could be the whole collaboration as a whole, then a few names of the people who actually wrote the paper, alphabetically ordered, then you start the alphabet again, for instance, with data analysts, etc. Of course, you need to determine for your specific collaboration which type of contribution goes into which tier. But then, as long as the first tier doesn't have hundreds of people, you can say, okay, sure, add all the telescope operators and the list. Doesn't matter if it becomes 3,000, 4,000 names long. If I know I'm in the first 10 place, alphabetically ordered, these are all on a par, then that still gives me credit to some extent. A few more things to consider. One is basically which came up on the last slide. What do you do with the collaboration as a whole, as a collective agent? Are you going to include that somehow? So you could, for instance, decide to put a collaboration as an author at the very beginning, or maybe at the end, or maybe normally do only the names, but you insist that when people cite the paper, they cite it using this rather than the names. So there are many options there. Another thing which I quite like, inspired by the IPCC, is that regardless of what you determine for the top of the paper, you can also say for every section specifically, separately, you add an extra author list saying like, for instance, then you can put on your CV like, oh, well, yeah, I'm somewhere down here in the top list, but I was also the main author of section 3, right? So to make it more concrete. And another thing is to try to find the right balance between collaboration papers, which include all members as authors, and to then, as a collaboration, also allow subsets of your members to write their own papers. But of course, you need to find the right balance there, because lots of people contributed, and if they only get like 1 or 2 papers out of it, that's not worth it for them. So you need to find the right balance there. But as in many situations, perhaps the simplest solution is the best solution, and we should just make everyone the first author. So let me slowly come to the end and say first a bit more about consensus and diversity of opinion. Right. So on the one hand, consensus, right, presenting a consensus result, right, having only one paper with the whole collaboration or one set of papers saying this is the result of our collaboration can be valuable, right, for various reasons. So typically you would expect if there are peers who have the same access to the data and the same background knowledge, when they are presented with the same evidence, you would expect, if science is rational, objective, reliable, that they actually reach the same conclusion. If there are more and more experts who believe a claim, then perhaps that's good reason to think that it's more likely to be true. And also if the consensus is stronger, then it might be easier for the public to accept the claim. In all these cases, you can think of the COVID pandemic, of course, as a case study as well. And if the flip side of that is if there's a lack of consensus, this can be used by politicians and skeptics to undermine science. On the other hand, this doesn't mean we should just focus and favor and insist on consensus at all costs. There can be drawbacks, right? If there's too much of a top-down enforcement of consensus, then this may disincentivize people deliberating and exploring alternatives for a long enough period. And in some cases, that might actually lead to the correct answer. It's often reported that in such large collaborations, when they're trying to reach consensus, that this leads to the claims eventually being watered down to remove all things that some parts of collaboration might disagree with. And then you end up with very conservative claims, which sometimes is a good idea, sometimes not. And just insisting on consensus on only one paper, one voice of a collaboration of thousands of people is probably just very implausible in very heterogeneous groups. of scientists with different values, different expertises, and that can often lead, or there's risks that minority opinions are not being heard, and also social tensions within the collaboration. If people feel like their voice is never heard, then why even contribute anymore? And also, if scientists only ever speak as if everyone agrees and there's no uncertainties, that's not how science works. It's very unrealistic, and it can of course harm the image of science if it's always oversimplified, and then if at some point it turns out we actually got the wrong answer, then this will be perhaps very shocking if we gave too simplified a picture, but more understandable if we were more upfront about the intricacies of science. So benefits and drawbacks of insisting on too much consensus. So what is this, how to think of dissenting views in the context of authorship, of writing papers together? Well, often, at least in particle physics nowadays, if you disagree with a paper, then often the only option you have is to take your name off the paper. That's not very satisfactory because you put in a lot of work, you don't get the credit, and also you don't actually get your own counter opinion heard. So this can lead to a lot of frustration. So you might think, okay, maybe in some scenarios, maybe when it comes to some important types of disagreement, it should be allowed that that group, minority group in the collaboration, publishes their minority counter view, counter conclusion. Right, so sometimes the US Supreme Court, even if they have one ruling, but some of the judges had a different view, they will publish a report of the explaining the minority view of the other judges. So inspired by that, you might think we should do in some cases the same for scientific collaborations. Then the question is, okay, well, what form should it take? Can it be somewhere in the main text, like reasons in favor and against this view, etc., or only as an appendix or some separate document? Will this increase or decrease the chance at social rifts, ruptures within the collaboration? Right. On the one hand, you might think if very publicly there's like conclusion P and conclusion not P are presented, this might lead to a lot of tension. On the other hand, if there's actually lots of disagreement and it never gets heard, and one view is presented to the public as representing the views of all people involved, that can also lead to social tension. So it really depends on the situation. And then if you think, okay, there should be some form, some way of expressing these alternative conclusions or caveats, should we do that then externally or maybe just internally? Well, externally there's the risk if you do that all the time, perhaps that it undermines trust in results and in science, and that journalists could use this to write the wrong type of report about the work. And if you just keep only these reports internally, basically what we've done is reinvented the wheel, have yet another layer of internal reviewing, which tends to make nobody happy. Yes, so these are some things to consider. That's it for now. I would say you have been given a credit and dissensus form to go through when you're working with a team at any point in this course. And I hope to see you at the end of October to discuss your experiences with this form and more generally your experiences with working together in teams with respect to the topics we've been discussing, authorship and dissensus. Thank you for your attention.